One of the biggest things that I feel like gets overlooked a lot is overfishing.
The health of our ocean, you alluded to it when you're talking about overfishing, it's really under pressure. And it's under pressure from intensive human activity. But despite all of that activity that's going on, the ocean's the least observed part of our planet. We really don't have a good clue or a good sense of what's happening. And that means that decision makers, they're not getting access to the timely information that they need to manage and protect the ocean.
How do we combat overfishing on a global scale? This has been a question that's been on the books for a long time. And the big thing is transparency. Knowing where fishing vessels go, where they're at, and how it's tracked throughout the supply chain. That's a big problem. But just tracking fishing vessels is one of the biggest problems and challenges around. And a 2024 study led by Global Fishing Watch, who we're going to be interviewing today, showed that 75% of industrial fishing fleets are not tracked. That is a dangerous number. So I have Courtney Farthing, who is the Director of International Policy at the Global Fishing Watch, who is here to talk about how we track fisheries and how we track fishing vessels and how important transparency is to the Global Fishing Watch. And we're going to be talking about that on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. Now in today's episode, we're going to be talking to Courtney Farthing from the Global Fishing Watch. She is the International Policy Director based in London, but Global Fishing Watch have their employees, their staff all over the world. This is what makes them such an effective organization. They've only been around for about 10 years, and they have become a major player in helping countries deal with transparency, looking at data operations and how interoperable they are, and making sure everybody's on the same standard, as well as tracking where the money goes, who profits from ocean fishing. Like that's really what it comes down to. Now that is more of a challenging thing that we talk about later on, but looking at, tracking transparency and fishing vessels is a huge important part of the Global Fishing Watch's mission. And they are working with countries to help that, especially using technology. Courtney talks about the 2025 Our Oceans Conference that happened in South Korea recently, and talks about what Global Fishing Watch wanted to accomplish, talking about digital oceans, talking about technology and transparency, and then how that international conference leads into the UN Ocean Decade Conference that happens in June this 2025. So we're going to talk a lot of things. We're going to go fishing vessel tracking, transparency. We're going to be talking about who profits. We're going to be talking about some of the challenges that are faced and some of the successes that we've had, as well as international conferences and how important they are. All on today's episode. So here is Courtney Farthing talking about transparency in fishing. Enjoy the interview, and we'll talk to you after. Hey, Courtney, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about global fishing?
Hi, Andrew. Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I am very excited because, look, we know Oceans Day is coming up. Oceans Week is coming up. There's a lot to talk about when we talk about oceans. But one of the biggest things that I feel like gets overlooked a lot, even though it's on the back of people's minds, just in the public, in the general public, is overfishing. And overfishing, and what are the causes? We've seen documentaries on there before that haven't been, too great. And we've, there's a lot of data out there to show what's happening. But in the general public, we blame fishermen in the fishing community overall. And there's obviously separation. There's a lot of nuances in that. But when it really comes to global fishing and looking at the problems of overfishing and addressing it, we really want to look at transparency. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm super excited. Before we get into all of that though, Courtney, why don't you just let us know who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrew. And thanks again for having me. My name's Courtney Farthing. I'm the International Policy Director at Global Fishing Watch. I've been with the organisation just over 5 years and working in this space for a little over a decade. Always on international and regional fisheries policies, negotiations. I studied this at university and really have been interested in it since I was a young child. So yeah, really happy to be here talking about it today.
That's awesome. What made, since a young child, for fishing, what made you interested? Did you grow up in a fishing community, or like what made you interested in fishing in general?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that probably a lot of people my generation that are British would have the same answer. There was this TV series led by David Attenborough, a TV presenter here in the UK called Blue Planet.
Yes.
Probably I was 5 or 6, and it just shook my little 5 or 6 year old world. I got the coffee table book with all the images. I was
Nice.
obsessed, and that obsession never really went away.
I mean, David Attenborough has that effect on people too, right?
Yes,
And I think he still
yeah,
has that
definitely.
effect, even though he's what in his well into his 90s. I think he's 99. I think I saw, which
Wow, yeah, I'm
is
not sure. Late 90s
yeah,
for sure.
late 90s for sure, unreal. But he's been definitely a pioneer in getting people interested in oceans and in fishing. And Blue Planet is such a great experience. Blue Planet 2 was even better. It just
Yeah,
gets better and better every
strength to
time.
strength.
Yeah, for sure. Now you work for Global Fishing Watch, and some of
Yes.
our members know, like some of our audience knows who Global Fishing Watch is. Some of them don't. Can you just kind of let us know, what Global Fishing does and why?
Yeah, yeah, no, thank you so much for the opportunity to introduce the organisation. So, I guess the context really, I'll start by saying that, the health of our ocean, you alluded to it when you're talking about overfishing, it's really under pressure. And it's under pressure from intensive human activity. But despite all of that activity that's going on, the ocean's the least observed part of our planet. We really don't have a good clue or a good sense of what's happening. And that means that decision makers, they're not getting access to the timely information that they need to manage and protect the ocean. So Global Fishing Watch is an international nonprofit that was born out of, I guess, frustration at trying to address those challenges. Our purpose is to transform the way that the ocean is managed. We want to kind of take the business as usual closed patchwork governance system and flip it on its head, to
Mm,
deliver an open, transparent global system. And we're dedicated to doing that by increasing the level of transparency of human activity at sea. What that means in reality is that we create data and tools that we share publicly to support anybody in the decision making process know more about what's going on and have as much publicly available information as possible at their fingertips for free.
that's awesome. I mean, transparency is such an important term, right? Um, it's something that we need to see more of. We talk a lot about transparency. We talk a lot about
Yeah.
what that actually means, where it actually gets implemented, and how it gets implemented. Governments talk about transparency a lot, but if you think
Mm.
about it, a lot of times governments aren't transparent with a lot of things. And
Yes.
so, what does transparency mean in specifically for Global Fishing Watch?
Yeah. So we believe essentially that all of the activity that goes on the high seas, that's those areas outside of a country's national waters, that's a common resource. And so therefore those activities should be common knowledge because of this common
Mhm.
resource. So Global Fishing Watch defines transparency as making information available and accessible to everyone that it affects. And that definition is pretty broad, it's based on one from the United Nations, and we really focus on ocean and vessel data transparency. As you say, there's a whole range of interpretations that it can be used for, but we're looking at ocean and vessel data, the policies and the decision making processes that govern those data.
Mhm.
And we believe that all of this information should be available and accessible to everyone with a stake in what happens to that resource. That could be the
Right.
fishing community, the local community experiencing secondhand impacts from high seas fishing, the researchers investigating trends, or the general public who just want to see, sustainable future for future generations.
That's amazing. It's so, like I said, it's so important to have transparency, but not everybody uses transparency. Like that's not a common thing
Yes.
in fishing. There are some tools that we can use, but it's not common. We'll discuss how we figured that out in the few
Mm-hmm.
in this interview. But what steps do you think people can take, or that just ocean governance in general can take, so that we can get more towards you know putting transparency to becoming more of the standard rather than the exception when you talk about ocean governance in general?
Yeah, I think there are two main things. Firstly, we need to increase the amount of transparent data. People need to be publishing things like their vessel tracking information, the identity of the vessels, where they're authorized to operate, who the owners are. And this is becoming increasingly available. But the second thing that we need is policies to regulate that and to require that. And that really needs to be strengthened. We're seeing a pretty massive shift, I would say, in attitudes towards
Hmm.
transparency of ocean and fisheries data. From our perspective at Global Fishing Watch, we're seeing now countries coming to us and asking how they can share more information as they start to see and experience the benefits that
Interesting.
that public information brings them. And in a really kind of pivotal moment for ocean transparency, at the end of last year, the United Nations adopted through consensus, so everybody agreed, which is pretty unusual, an assembly resolution that features text specifically on transparency in fisheries. Recognizes the role that transparency has to play in sustainable fishing practices, and it urges countries and international bodies to consider ways that they can better integrate transparent practices. So it's really brilliant progress, but we've still got quite a way to go. We really need to see fishing nations publishing their vessel registries. That's who they allow to fish, including the details on who's actually benefiting from those fishing operations, not just who's working on the vessels, but who's profiting from the
Hmm.
operations, the ultimate beneficial owner.
Hmm.
And that gives everyone information on what the vessel's allowed to do, where, and who's benefiting. And we also need to see publication of vessel tracking information so that we can see where the vessels have been operating, where they authorised to operate there. Um, there are these systems that have traditionally been closed to the public that have been used to monitor tracking. But we're seeing, as I said before, a kind of a shift in attitudes, and more vessels publish their tracking data.
Right.
And if we have these policies in place, those changes can withstand, changes in government, changes in personnel, the rules already written, and countries can also improve them over time and undergo technical capacity development programs to really strengthen their implementation. But without the policy framework in place, none of that's able to happen.
That's so cool. I have a question for you in what you said.
Yeah,
When
please.
we're talking about some of the data hasn't been made available to public, so you were talking about some of the tracking data is
Yeah,
available, it's just not made available public to other nonprofit organizations or non-governmental organizations, just more within that country. It's within there.
yeah,
And then there's probably other countries who aren't tracking a lot of their fishing. Just in general, they may not have the technology, they may not have the ability, or it's just not in their practices or in their
yeah.
traditional practices, right? So there's a lot of different. I mean, there's so many countries you're probably dealing with. It's
Mm-hmm.
probably a lot of people, a lot of different cultures, different people, different countries around the world who are just like, yeah, we just never thought of that. How
Yeah.
important is it for Global Fishing Watch to be able to work with countries like that to say, hey, look, this is what we've seen around the world that's been working. Are you interested, especially countries coming to you saying, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it must feel good that countries are coming to you and being like, hey, how do we implement this? But how do you work with those countries when they come to you? I assume you don't go to them, they come to you, and then you work with them. Is that how it works?
Yeah, I guess it's a little bit of both. Global Fishing Watch, through all of our research and the great innovation teams work that we have, we're able to identify perhaps where the challenges are, where there is a lot of tracking information already, and therefore where there maybe isn't. And we might make approaches to those countries and find out, are there challenges that are preventing them from using these systems? Is it a cost issue? Is it a resource issue? And similarly, we get approached by countries for specific issues, and we might help them with that specific issue and then broaden our
Mm-hmm.
program of work together to look at the bigger picture over time. But yeah, there is these different systems in place in terms of vessel tracking, and the more traditional one is closed. There is an open one that has historically been used for safety at sea, that's becoming increasingly common to use as part of a tool of uh, options for fisheries management, and we're really seeing people embrace that more than ever.
Amazing. Now, our Oceans Conference, the 2025 Oceans Conference, just finished
Yes.
up this earlier this month, and it was in Busan. I think I'm pronouncing that properly.
Yes.
South Korea. Good.
Yeah.
Now, one of the themes of the conference was digital oceans. Now, this seems to play right into what we're talking about here in terms of
Yeah.
transparency, in terms of making it available to people. Technology plays a huge role in that, in terms of tracking vessels and making it public in databases and so forth. And we're in a bit of a revolution in terms of like a digital revolution where we're starting to see more of that available. But there's still that open question of, as to the role of technology that has been delivering to deliver more sustainable and transparent ocean governance. So how do you see technology fitting in and delivering good ocean governance, especially when it's referring to transparency?
Yeah, I mean, lots of people obviously think technology is going to solve all problems everywhere, and
Yeah.
that's certainly not Global Fishing Watch's position.
Right.
Technology is crucial, essentially, for helping people to be more effective. It's
Right.
not something that's going to, solve the issues on its own. It's always about giving more information, better information, more succinct information to people. So, for example, you might have a foreign vessel request entry into a port. So, say, Canadian vessel, as you're in Canada, requesting entry into UK waters, as I'm here in London.
Right.
And the UK authorities might want more information about what that vessel's been doing. They have two options, really. They can ask the vessel operator and take their word. If they're not sure if some information's missing, they can contact the Canadian authorities and
Mm-hmm.
ask them to fact check, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And traditionally, you might have a notebook that has a list of people handwritten with a phone number, a fax information, email address.
Yeah.
And that pretty quickly becomes outdated and unhelpful. People change jobs, and
Of course.
is that a 3 or an 8? I don't know. And technology helps you to fix that problem. There is this really potentially a transformative tool called the Global Record, which
Mm-hmm.
is a UN initiative. It's a international transparent database of vessel records, and that would provide a single source of information with all of that in it. And if countries keep that information up to date, then your notebook's obsolete, and who you need to contact is very clear.
Yeah.
Um, Another
And
example,
it makes it faster for people to connect, because you can just almost
exactly.
automate that process to, like, if I don't know who this Canadian vessel is, or I don't have as much
Yeah,
information, an email could trigger to be sent right to the authorities in Canada to be like, oh, so Coast Guard's like, yes, no, we know this vessel and here's the information. Boom, updated. It works seamlessly,
exactly.
right?
Exactly. And there's like less opportunity for misinterpretation because you're coming at it from the
Yeah.
same underlying data. So, in that way, technology is really helpful.
Yeah.
Another example that springs to mind is a vessel might show, your Canadian vessel, it would be unusual, but your Canadian vessel might tell me in the UK that they're authorized to fish for tuna in the Pacific Ocean.
Right.
But I have access to transparent tracking information. And so I can see actually, okay, this vessel was recently fishing in the Indian Ocean. So
Yeah.
are
Why
they
is that?
authorized in the Indian Ocean, or is there an issue here? And
Right.
technology allows you to very rapidly pull together all of the different sources related to that specific vessel and cross check, as well as highlighting who the owner of the vessel is. So you have the transparency of the data,
Yeah.
the technology pulling together all these different sources and allowing you as the user to choose where to dig deeper. Good governance can only be delivered by the authorities, as we said, it's the people.
Right.
But it's the people having access to that information and saying, okay, this owner is problematic. We've had an issue with this owner
Mm-hmm.
before. Yes, we need to investigate further. Or this vessel, it actually is authorized to operate in the Indian Ocean. It's just that this database hasn't been updated yet, but these other 4 have, and therefore we
Gotcha.
don't need to do anything else. It's not realistic that
Mm-hmm.
these deep dives will be made out on every single fisheries decision. Countries just don't have the resources.
Yeah.
But transparency and technology, they allow people to be more effective in choosing where those resources get allocated.
Well, and also like the speed at which decisions can be made too. Like
Yeah,
obviously having multiple databases from each country and not integrating them is a problem which can be
yeah,
changed. We know that now, but also the speed at which, like, we're talking, our example before was, a legal example where it's like just,
yeah.
people coming into a different port but may not have the information. That happens all the time. And so
Hmm.
it automatically gets updated. Boom, no problem. But when you have illegal fishing happen, and then you have somebody go in, like a ship that comes in through to a port, empties out and leaves probably within a couple of hours, it's
Yeah.
very difficult for the authorities to even be dispatched or even to recognize that that is not a fishing vessel that is in good standing or has
Yeah.
had problems, like you said before, but they can't act on it until they get there. Now, I have heard of cases where AI is being used or being explored in being able to quicken that process. And I'm sure, like, data, was it data mining and so forth, like
Mhm.
these types of technologies can help. Is Global Fishing Watch involved in any of that type of work where we're looking at upgrading that technology to speed up the process where, authorities at the port can be dispatched in time so these vessels are caught before they come into port?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really core program of work for us. These systems that you're talking about, they've been in place in many developed nations for a
Okay.
long time. And so, what Global Fishing Watch is really trying to do is bring together those elements and give them to developing nations for free, so that the
Right.
developing nations have access to the same, like, cutting edge, innovative tools that will save them resources in the long run. We have two programs of work that are directly related to what you're talking about. One is for port inspections, and we have a tool, you can find it on our website, it's called Vessel Viewer. It really collates all of that information in an easy to understand way. You can type in a vessel name, a vessel identifier, a fleet, a flag, whatever you like, and it
Hmm.
will give you very, very quickly, very rapidly, much quicker than my Google searching, 5, 10, 15 different data sources of
Yeah.
information for that vessel, and you can quickly scan and see, okay, these don't match, therefore I want to take action. And then the second program of work is similar, but is really focused on supporting boardings and inspections, so coast guards, and using the same data sources but presenting it in a way that helps patrol planning. And yeah, we've been doing that for a long time and had some great successes.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Now, talking about technology and vessel tracking, in Busan, Global Fishing Watch spoke quite prominently about the great need for binding vessel agreement tracking agreements. What is
Yeah.
vessel tracking, and like, why should it matter for those concerned about effective global ocean governance?
Yeah, so vessel tracking is the ability to detect, identify, and monitor a ship's location
Yeah.
and map the full details of the ship's journey. So, from the port that they leave from through to their final destination. And we can track our cars like this, our
Right.
aeroplanes, even our merchant vessels in the same ocean. But really surprisingly, there's no global requirement for all fishing vessels that leave their own national waters to be tracked.
Hmm.
And we can't fix what we can't see. So without a full data informed picture, the true
Yeah.
scale of the human activity at sea and all of the impacts that add up, we can't manage them effectively, and we
Right.
can't take informed or preemptive actions to address their issues. So, if you're concerned about the sustainability of your haddock here in the UK, or the human rights conditions of the supply chain where your pet food comes from, or the degradation of the Great Barrier Reef,
Hmm.
you should care really that there's no global binding tracking requirement, because these things all add up and they all equal increasing pressure on our ocean.
Yeah.
Knowing what fishing vessels are doing and where allows us to understand the pressures, how they accumulate, and how we can manage them before they do irreparable damage to our ocean's health.
Yeah, and it's really interesting too, because I think, when you talk about vessel tracking for
Hmm.
fishing, you would think that all fishers don't want people to know where they go. They
Right.
have their own special spot, so they'd be against it. But there's a number of examples where that hasn't been the case. I remember when I was in school, and I was in graduate school, we had
Yeah.
Brian Day, who was heading of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park at the time in early
Right.
2000. He came over. He was a good friend of my supervisor, John Roth, and they came over and he did a presentation on how they increased their no take areas, or their no, like, nobody goes in those areas, from 3% to 33%, I think, at the time. So they
Right.
increased it by
Wow.
30%, but they did it using vessel tracking. So when they put in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, they actually put trackers on fishing vessels. And so when
Okay.
they looked at, like, where they were, and they looked at what areas, like the reserves, or the no take, no research, no nothing reserves went in, and they wanted to increase it, they actually noticed that the fishers weren't even going in. and they weren't even going into that area because they had that tracking vessel. So when they present it to the fishing community, they're like, at first, before they laid the track down, I remember him telling the story. They're like, oh yeah, this is where we want to increase. And they're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, why are we increasing there? And they're like, oh yeah, by the way, here's the layer of where you guys have been. You're not even in that area.
Going. Yeah.
And they're all just like, oh, well, okay, no problem. Like it's perfect. So people, there are times and situations where it actually helps conservation. Now that's not always going to be the time. There's conflict management. That's why you bring in that fishing community early on in the process. But there are times when it can be really helpful. Now we're looking at technology, and I know AIS is a very big part of vessel tracking. So it's a GPS system, a very simple system that tracks. And I've worked on that data before when I worked as a consultant for the government, and it's a very important thing in looking at shipping lanes and where people are going. Are they abiding by it, so forth? And then of course, are they in marine protected areas here in Canada when I worked on it? But there's also a difference. I think you can turn it on and off whenever you wanted to, or there's ways to get around it. And now, and this kind of goes into my next question, because like in a 2024 study that published in Nature, which was led by and led by Global Fishing Watch researchers. And I've always wanted to ask this question from you guys.
Yes.
About 75% of the industrial fishing fleet does not appear in public monitoring systems, which is insane to think about. You think you have this technology, not always AIS, but you have all this technology that you can put on. But then you find out that 3/4 of the industrial fishing fleet does not actually use it. So how, like you mentioned before, how can you track what you don't know? Like, how can you monitor what you don't know? So I guess like my question is like, how can transparency and technology shine a light on the sort of the hidden happenings around the ocean? Like, how do we increase that to 75% or even more being tracked instead of the opposite?
Yeah, flipping it. I guess, it comes back to that point that we were talking about at the start about, Global Fishing Watch's purpose being to flip from a closed, system to an open one. And much of that activity, to be clear, we're not saying it's not tracked at all. It's just not publicly tracked. So much of that activity is probably being tracked by closed monitoring systems. Typically, that's vessel monitoring systems, or VMS.
Yep.
And that data is shared between the vessel itself and the flag state. That's the country that has allowed the vessel to go out and leave and go in international waters. And this is how traditional, kind of more old school vessel tracking, monitoring, control, and surveillance works. The tracking information is confidential. It's only shared between the vessel and the flag state. And the theory is, exactly as you said, Andrew, it protects these kind of commercial sensitivities, such as good fishing spots, whilst allowing the authorities, who are the ones ultimately responsible, to see what the vessel's doing. But this means if somebody else, like me as the UK port state, or you as the coastal state giving a license for their vessel to fish in a different spot, they don't know what's happening. They can't see it. So they can take the vessel's word for it, or they can contact the flag with all those challenges that we spoke about before.
Yeah.
And, we have seen decades of industrial fishing now, and decades of this happening on the high seas. And in reality, what we are seeing is that flag states, they're not able to consistently meet the demand of these inquiries that are coming. And, we at Global Fishing Watch have worked with countries where we've seen these requests go unanswered completely, go unanswered for weeks, or people not being able to get in touch with the right contacts. And we've also heard from flag states that have said to us, it's so much better when everything's public, because then we're only contacted if there's a real issue, and then we can dedicate our resources to figuring that out with whoever's contacted us. And we've also seen these kind of unscrupulous operators looking to take advantage of those issues and looking to benefit themselves by, exactly as you say, falsifying the information they provide, pretending they're over here when really they're only here. And having multiple data sources, having the VMS and the AIS, allows you to cross-check and to compare and to understand where there are issues.
And that's so important, because we know like the honor system doesn't work anymore. We've seen that happen over and over and over again. And it would have been nice if it did work, and then we could just trust everybody, and then maybe there'd be only a small percentage of players, but 75% seems a little sketchy. Like, why wouldn't you want to know, where you've been? Like, if you're doing everything right, why wouldn't you want to know? And I think that was what was scariest to me. It was like 75%. That's a lot.
Huge.
That's huge. And was it surprising to the organization, like to you, like just being like, holy cow, like I would expect it under 50%, but 75, like the majority like by a lot. I mean, you don't even get that many people. I'm about, we had a federal election here recently, and I don't think we had 75% people come out to vote. So imagine
Yes.
75% of the people like not even tracking their vessels.
Yeah, it was surprising, and I think it really just reiterated the scale of the issue and the seriousness with which Global Fishing Watch needs to treat this issue. And
Right.
we use that in our interventions at the UN. We use that in our bilateral discussions that we have with countries to really show, like, you might not think this is a huge problem, but globally this really is a huge problem. And that argument continues to surface. We need to protect our special fishing spot that maybe like your
Yeah,
grandfather found or whatever
of
that might
course.
be. But in reality, that is quite outdated now.
Mm-hmm.
Other
Things are
technologies, not
changing.
just tracking technologies, have changed so much, right? You can find huge schools of fish more quickly than you've ever been able to before. And so many locations are broadcast, as you say, via AIS for safety reasons. This
Mm-hmm.
concept of the secret fishing spot or the perfect fishing spot that others don't know about. Of course, there are exceptions, but generally it's not really a reality anymore. Plus, at Global Fishing Watch, as I said it from the outset, if activities occurring, in a common area on a common resource, we think it should be common knowledge.
Yeah, and it's like especially within. I mean, there's also the difference between like within the exclusive economic zones and outside. I
Yeah.
mean, especially within the exclusive economic zone, it's a natural resource for that country. The citizens of that
Right.
country should have access, and then people and organizations such as Global Fishing Watch and yourself can come out and say, "Hey, look, we specialize in this." Right, like we look at this, we'll take this data and we'll do analysis on this, we'll
Yeah.
see where people go, and we'll give you the information, probably as a benefit to those countries to have the
Hmm.
specialists. Like Global Fishing Watch is literally global. You guys are all around the world, and
Yes.
spaced all around the world, so you understand sort of the different contexts and nuances of each country, and where you live, and the regions in which where you live. So you have that specialist group to be able to take that data that's available publicly, provide that analysis to the country, and just be like, hey, look, we want to help you. And I guess it leads to my next question is like, how is Global Fishing Watch, working with other countries and governments to mainstream vessel tracking? I know we talked a little bit about how you work with countries before, but
Yeah.
to mainstream vessel tracking, it's got to be a bit of a challenge because, like I said before, there are some countries who may not even have it available,
Yeah.
or may not, and some just may not make it public, which might be a little easier. So, how do you get through that and to mainstream that vessel tracking?
Yeah, you're right. We work with a number of countries, and the most important thing really is country context. We're, an international team, a global team of experts on vessel tracking, but we're not a global team of experts on vessel tracking in Senegal or in the UK or in
Right.
Canada or in Ghana or in the Marshall Islands. That country context is really important. So everything has got to be a partnership with the governments that we're working with. We really need to understand why their system was developed the way it was, if it's meeting their needs, what their challenges are. And we do that through a combination of learning from the government, working with them, really digging deep into understanding how they work, with partners on the ground, with other non-profits, with researchers, with local universities, and with people that we hire into Global Fishing Watch to work on projects that perhaps have worked in that country for a number of years. And a really significant portion of the work that we do as an organisation with countries is specifically focused on vessel tracking. So
Mm-hmm.
we help countries to review their policies around vessel tracking. Does your legislation meet the needs that you have? Do your regulations have the requirements that you need? Are they out of date? Could they be updated? Is there weak or vague wording which bad actors could take advantage of? And we go to the country and we spend time there, and we go through normally a week long process to co-develop a program of work that really looks at all the different challenges and makes recommendations on how public vessel tracking could help them. But you've got to meet them where they are, right? You can't be going and making recommendations for like a platinum system when the
Right.
fundamentals aren't in place. So that does vary country to country.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that we have really learned throughout our kind of last number of years working with countries on this is that AIS, that automatic identification system technology, is really valued by a lot of countries for its cost
Cool.
effectiveness. So, vessel monitoring systems, VMS, is pretty expensive, and lots
Right.
of countries they have it and they don't pay for it, so therefore it's not getting used, or they don't have it at all. Whereas AIS, much more reasonably priced, much more affordable. Whilst it may not be perfect, meeting a country where they have nothing, this is
Yeah.
something, and we start with them there. And then, kind of taking that one step further, we often support them to engage in regional and international discussions on vessel tracking that perhaps they might not have been paying attention to or been able to be engaged with before. And
Hmm.
that's a lot of kind of learning from others, sharing experiences, discussing challenges, and requesting help from the international community where they think they could benefit. And so far, this has been pretty successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that to see, more countries being interested in, and I do get the fact that there are some countries who just need to, just a little help to get up above, and let's just start with tracking in general, get
Yeah,
the basic information, which is location. There's, and as a somebody who's involved in GIS,
yeah,
loves maps, and a visual learner, as many of us are, to be able to see those stories develop, and to be able to see where people are going, and to find out when people are going at certain times, and so forth, and to be like, look, this is a big fishing spot, but it's around this area. Why is it around this area?
hmm,
And you can really collate a lot of science around that, and a lot of research around that. So I do love that. Now, obviously, vessel tracking is one part. It's a big, significant part, especially with that 2024 study that was led by
yeah,
Global Watch, looking at that. Um, but there's also other things that have come up in the past, where, especially when we're looking at illegal fishing, and you mentioned it earlier, is tracking who benefits
yeah,
from the profits of selling these fish, whether they're legally caught or illegally caught, like just a registry of owners of not only vessels, but like the owners of who's getting the final profit of it all.
right.
Because there have been stories that have come out that we've covered on this podcast, where we're looking at illegal fishing. There was one vessel in particular who went through like decades long reputation of going into ports under different flags, and then being going in.
Mm,
And when they finally caught it, they caught the vessel, they couldn't track who it was to, like who owned
right.
it. And it was over a lot, and it got into a lot of not only politics, but there was like organized crime involved, and things
Right.
like that. And it gets very complex. So tracking the vessel is one thing, and it's obviously a very important thing physically. It's like the basic thing that we need. But then when we track who profits off of this, how is that research or that program going? Is Global Fishing Watch involved in that as well? And how is that, where are we at with that type of tracking?
Yeah, Global Fishing Watch is definitely involved in that. I'd say those are our kind of those are two of our three big policy areas that we focus on internationally. And that is because they're just big international gaps on these topics.
Mm-hmm.
Tracking, we've covered, you're talking about beneficial ownership. And the third one that we look at is the interoperability of data and the standards of data, much more technical.
Mm,
But those are our three
right.
big areas. And ownership is probably the furthest behind, needs the most amount of attention and
Yeah.
leadership. We're seeing lots of people embrace tracking transparency and data quality measures. We're not really seeing, country after country coming forward and publishing their ownership data. And in some
Mm-hmm.
cases, we're seeing, restrictions of that data and tightening of data privacy rules to cover commercially sensitive information that the country considers commercially sensitive. And it is a real challenge because, as you mentioned, there's so many loopholes that smart, unscrupulous operators can use to their
Mm-hmm.
advantage. They can change the name, they can change the flag, they can call in one port and then another, and leave. And what happens? Nobody knows who they are. And then finally, as you
Yeah.
say, you get to who's been doing the bad behaviour. You issue a huge fine. It goes through your courts, loads of work on your behalf, and all you have is the operator, who of course can't pay that fine. They're
No.
manning a fishing vessel. That's not, you don't get the fine, you don't get
Right.
the satisfaction or the sanction, and the owner's not deterred. They just do it again with a different vessel.
Yep.
So we really do need transparency of beneficial ownership information. There is a route for it with the United Nations. As I mentioned before, this global record has a space in this app. It's essentially an app to upload all of this information, but we just need leadership from countries to
Mm.
navigate the data privacy rules, interpret how that can be shared, and commit to sharing that information.
And I'm sure that's not an easy thing. We know the process, but just the fact of just displaying, you know, information, like financial information from private companies is a problem within itself. Maybe from publicly traded companies, you can start to install those types of
Yeah.
measures and policies, but from a private company who they don't really want you to see their books all the time for a number of different reasons, it could be very challenging. So hopefully we can get further and further on that. And
Yeah.
obviously we're at the beginning stages, but I love the fact that, the vessel tracking is getting up. Countries are interested. Same with data interoperability, like trying to be able to make sure we have the same standards and we're all comparing at the same rate. I think it's great because, it's one ocean. So we should be talking about one
Exactly.
type of fisheries. Now I know the ocean conference our ocean conference just wrapped up in Busan, South
Yeah.
Korea. And we're now looking forward to, we're just about to go into the UN Ocean Conference, the Ocean Decade
Yeah.
Conference in Nice, France, which I hope to be there. Hopefully I'll be
Oh,
there.
great.
So what are the main takeaways from Busan, and how can we push that into the Ocean Decade Conference?
Yeah, so I think that all these kind of international conferences, events like the Our Ocean Conference, the United Nations Ocean Conference, they're really important to ocean conservation because they serve as, I guess, a platform for optimism. They are
Yeah.
a place where people, they're celebrated for the good work that they're doing, and they create this momentum around a topic or an issue, and stakeholders go and they feel that and they want to be a part of that and they want to have something to contribute and to be celebrated for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And this environment leads to a lot of country commitments, governments standing on stage and promising that
Mm-hmm.
X square kilometres of ocean will be protected or Y fisheries data will be published. And this might sound a little bit empty, but it's really important because without it, we can easily fall into a space where countries are very domestically focused. They don't feel any external pressure to
Right.
keep following the curve. And therefore, they're perfectly happy if lots of people are doing that and they're just staying in their lane. And so these conferences can really bring people along on a progressive journey that, those countries might not have done anything at all otherwise. Coming out of Busan, the most exciting commitment from Global Fishing Watch's perspective was made by Panama. Panama
Oh, cool.
announced that they will improve the transparency and accessibility of their ultimate beneficial ownership data for the international fishing fleet. And that's really significant because
Yeah.
Panama has hundreds of vessels that operate all around the world, and they're going to be publishing a list of those owners. And that means that decision makers will have access to that when they need it, not, months later. If there is an issue, it is the actual beneficiary that will be
Mm-hmm.
sanctioned, not the operators, as we spoke about. Owners aren't able to kind of hide behind all these different structures. It's clear this is the owner.
Yeah.
And decision makers can use that information as part of their risk assessment criteria. We spoke
Mm-hmm.
before about, I've had an issue with this owner in the past. Maybe I'm going to prioritize looking at all the other vessels that are owned by the same person.
Yeah.
And, maybe I'm not going to grant them a license, or maybe I'm going to, board and inspect.
Yeah.
And Panama's leadership on this issue is so much more valuable than just for the Panamanian fleet, because others will follow suit, right? They're standing up and they're leading, and it creates this momentum. That's what I hope we can take from Busan into Nice. I hope that we can get to others talking about the topic and others considering these kind of common areas of
Mm-hmm.
pushback, that this is like really resource intensive to do. Well, Panama's got hundreds of vessels and they found a way to do it, a very smart way of doing it that puts the burden on the company, not on the government. And the second, area of pushback commonly, that the data is protected by data privacy rules. Well, Panama's, got that in their legislation. They've studied it. They've found a way to make sure that certain information is restricted, certain information is published. It is able to be made public whilst respecting those data privacy rules.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a blocker to the publication of the owner information. So I'm really excited
Yeah. That's
by this
huge.
commitment, and I hope that others will be following suit going into Nice.
Yeah, and you're right. Like, at these conferences, these international conferences, we do see big press conferences on commitments that people make, and I agree with you that it allows us to hold them accountable. It
Right.
allows us, and it even gives, I'm sure, an organization like Global Fishing Watch to be like, oh, hey, we'd like to work with you to help you get
Yeah.
there. Here's our experience, and then we can help you. And then I think that's a great way to do it. But there's a lot of events that go on during these international conferences. How does Global Fishing Watch navigate all these events? And like, are you speaking with representatives from different countries, either through past contacts or meeting new contacts? Like, what's the approach? I always talk about going to a conference, and everybody's got to have a strategy when you get there. I'm
Yes.
sure Global Fishing Watch does the same thing. What's the strategy when you approach these international conferences? I don't know, like when you Global Fishing Watch, are you going to Nice, or is some, like I assume some other people are going to Nice?
My colleagues will be in Nice. Yeah, our
Oh,
CEO,
perfect.
our chief program officer, and representatives from the international policy team will definitely be in Nice. Yeah, it's a
Perfect.
good question. I think there's two approaches.
Hmm.
One is kind of turn up and speak to as many people as possible.
Yeah.
And the second is 99% of the work is done before you even get on the flight. And Global
Interesting.
Fishing Watch, we kind of take that second approach. We start prepping probably at least 4 or 5 months before the conference. We're
Okay.
working normally with the conference organizers to see if there's anything we can do to help with the agenda, suggesting speakers, suggesting that we've been working with this country and they've got something really exciting they might want to talk about in this plenary session, or we've seen this latest development, it might make a really good case study for a side event. We would also be supporting the countries that we work with to navigate this as well, putting
Yeah.
together a briefing pack, going through all the sessions, making sure the country can really make the most and talk about the stuff that we've been doing together in each of the fora that's relevant. Perhaps helping to prepare speeches, things like that, and reviewing those announcements, suggesting where it could be strengthened or made more exciting, more bulletproof, um, and even sometimes looking at working on a plan for how that commitment's going to be implemented, so that the government feels confident going in, that they know the commitment is solid, they have a plan for doing it. But yeah, it's really exciting. It can be a lot of firefighting right at the very last minute. Ministers change,
Yeah.
language requirements change. It's
Yeah.
very varied, but it's a really cool part of international policy work.
I love it. I think it's really important, and I think I'm glad you were able to come on the podcast today. Very happy to be able to discuss policy. It's not something that we get to talk about all the time. A lot of time
Yeah,
when ocean hits the news, it's with an animal and fun things that happen,
sure.
or like recently, I think it was a couple months ago, a kayaker got swallowed up by a humpback or something like
Right.
that. You get news like that, but you don't get news in terms of what happens at these conferences,
Yeah,
how organizations approach these conferences. My goal is to get as many interviews as possible when I go to these places,
yeah,
and to find out as much information as possible what's happening there. But I mean, it's an important aspect. These international conferences are important. They play a big role in international work that's done after those conferences, and like I
they
said,
do.
holding countries accountable and negotiating with countries to help them out, and building your networks and building your frameworks for the future. So Courtney, I want to thank you so much for spending time with me today and spending time with us at the audience to let us know not only what you and Global Fishing Watch do, but also what is on par for these conferences and what has happened at the Our Oceans conference. So I think it's really, really important. So thank you so much for joining us on today's episode.
No, thank you so much for having me, Andrew. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Courtney, for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was great to be able to discuss what Global Fishing Watch does, as well as the policies that they work on, the technology that they're working on, where technology is and where it needs to be, and how it's being used is such an important part to tackle overfishing on a global scale. And I think having an organization that's only 10 years old and being able to be a prominent figure in that world and having countries come to you for help is such a testament to how well they've done over that time. When a new organization comes in, especially looking at fishing, a lot of people may say, oh, they're the overseers, they're going to out people, they're going to be more of an advocacy and activism organization. And then they come out and they say, no, this is what we do. And they show people, they execute what they do and how well they perform. And it just goes to show now where they're at a point where countries are coming to them to be like, hey, we're here, you're working on, transparency and fishing vessel tracking. Hey, can we find out how you're doing that? Because, we have these policies and we want to make sure that we're doing it properly, and you've been working on it. They've specialized in it. I can't tell you enough how little resources some countries have, even including Canada, my own. We don't have a lot of staff when it comes to government, and governments like to cut, so they lower their resources. So we don't have a lot of people with eyes on fishing and trying to combat overfishing here in Canada, as well as other places in the world and other countries in the world. And so it's difficult to be able to just have people do it and have those resources do it. You need technology to help you out. And that's what we discussed here. And I thought it was addressed very, very well. I'm very enthusiastic about what can become and how AI and data learning and machine learning is working to help address things quickly and appropriately. So that's going to be a lot of fun. So if you have any questions or comments, you can leave in the comments below. And if you're watching this on YouTube, or you can DM me at How to Protect the Ocean on Instagram. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. Or you can go to our speakupforblue.com site, hit the contact us, send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. It goes right to my personal email. I'll answer back within a week, because I do get a lot of emails and I'm busy, but I would love to chat with you. That's the whole point there. So thank you so much. I do appreciate you listening. I do appreciate you joining us, and I'll put all the links to Global Fishing Watch that you need to learn about. And I want to thank you for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin from the True North Strong and Free. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.